Afternoon, everybody.
Give me 1 second. I'll start right here. Hi, this is Sarah Ray from Bloomfield Public Library. We're excited to have Sahara back from Smart Funeral Planning. And today we were talking about cremation. So now I'll turn the mic over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to the Bloomfield Library. Thank you for everybody in attendance this afternoon. I know that cremation and funeral planning is oftentimes an avoided topic of conversation, but although we avoid it, it is one of the few things that we have in common as human beings traveling through this planet. So again, I thank you for being here. I hope that you find this presentation informational, and I hope that it inspires you to begin doing some planning and recording of your wishes for your survivors. As a funeral director, I can't tell you how often family members walk through the doors of a funeral home completely unprepared, unable to answer questions about their loved one's wishes. So if you're considering cremation or if you've decided on cremation already, I hope this answers some of your curiosities. And like Sarah said, we will have some time at the end for question and answer. So I'm going to share my screen here. You guys all able to see that title screen? Okay. So to tell you about myself, one of the first questions I always get asked when I meet people is, why in the world did you become a funeral director? What were you thinking? How did you get into this? Is it a family business? No, my family thinks I'm crazy. None of them had anything to do with funeral service, but my mom did lose her mom fairly young. And then her brother was murdered. So death was a common topic in my house. My dad was very religious. So besides going to church all the time, my mom was befriending terminally ill people and trying to comfort them through their journey. And I was going to a lot of funerals. And growing up in Las Vegas, both my parents were in the casino industry. So when I was going to these funerals, I was like, oh my God, there's a profession outside of the casino industry. How great is that? So my guidance counselor encouraged me to look into funeral planning. I did, and left my home in Las Vegas to attend McAllister Institute, which is in New York City. I served my apprenticeship out of Stamford, Connecticut, and got licensed in 2016. I worked for several years as a funeral director in the capacity that you would imagine, answering the phone at the time of a death and helping families through that part of the process, contacting the religious institutions, kind of scheduling the burials or cremations, and actually doing the work. During the pandemic, my husband, who's also a funeral director, we were extremely busy, and we had 2 daughters. Their schools closed, and we were dragging them into the funeral home to do their homework and their schoolwork. So I knew that something had to change. So in January of 2021, I quit my job as an at-need, we call it in the industry, at-need funeral director, and I switched gears into planning in advance. So now I focus on educating people through community seminars, libraries, senior centers, assisted living facilities, and really just getting the word out that, hey, did you know you could pre-plan and prepay for your funeral, and oftentimes save a lot of money and stress in the process of doing so. So these days, I fortunately don't have to serve in the at-need capacity. I solely help people answer questions in advance of need and encourage them to record their wishes for their survivors. So here we are talking about cremation. I had a general funeral planning seminar that I did a lot of, but then I started thinking, cremation is so popular, how do we not have a separate seminar just focused on cremation? Most of the questions I was getting asked had to do with cremation. The national average rate of cremation in the country is now over 50%. So I'm sure that some of you on this call, if not all of you, are going for cremation yourself. I personally want a green burial. So I'm always curious, is cremation selected because of the price? Is it truly a preferred option? So I kind of started investigating that to figure out why cremation was so popular. And in doing so, I gathered a whole bunch of information. So our agenda for today is going to first be to define cremation and talk about what that process actually looks like step by step. Next, I want to talk about what your options are with cremation. So many people have this idea that I just want a simple cremation, but I'm here to tell you cremation is far from simple. There are hundreds of options that come along with it. And if you just tell your family you want to be cremated, they do not have all the answers that they need. So we're going to go over all the various options that exist with cremation. We'll talk a bit about alternative options to cremation. So if you don't want to be cremated, gone are the days that you only have two options. There are many more options and more becoming available every day for final disposition. I'll move on then to 3 steps of pre-planning. So no excuses. It's very simple. You can get your plans done in 3 simple steps. We'll talk on some other considerations like Medicaid, Title 19, prepaid funeral contracts, veterans benefits, Social Security benefits, and then we'll open it up to questions at the end. So what is cremation? Cremation is a form of disposition, and there are, I believe, right now in Connecticut, legal options. There are 3. One would be traditional burial with a casket and an outer burial container in a traditional cemetery. I'm going to turn off my space heater because my throat's closing. Second option, of course, is cremation, what we're talking about today. And this form of cremation is a form of disposition that gets done through burning. Cremated remains can be interred at a memorial site after the cremation, or they can be retained by relatives. Of course, we can scatter them, we can send them to the moon. We'll go over some more of those options in detail on the next slide. The cremation process itself is very detailed. First of all, when a death occurs, there's a 48-hour hold in the state of Connecticut before a funeral home can move forward with any sort of transfers or cremation itself. During those 48 hours, it's the funeral director's job to confirm the identity of the deceased. Oftentimes, we'll have forms that the individual who's present at the time of us transferring the deceased into our care would sign, stating that, yes, this is their loved one, their spouse, their parent. If it's in a nursing facility or at a hospital, of course, we would have the hospital or the nursing facility staff confirm the identification of the deceased. But as you can imagine, that's a very important first step. Once we confirm the identification and have all the necessary sign-offs from the family and the medical examiner and the town hall, we would contact the crematory. Important to know that in Connecticut, crematories very often are not owned by the funeral homes. It's a separate entity. Some funeral homes do own and operate their own crematory on their premises, but I do believe there's a very limited number of crematories in Connecticut. I would say less than 10, which all 250 plus funeral homes are required to use. They have a bit of a monopoly, it seems. And right now, I don't think it's possible for Connecticut to give permits for any more construction for more crematories. So it looks like it'll stay that way for quite some time. The reason I'm telling you this is oftentimes when people want cremation, especially readers, and I know I'm talking to a group from the library, so I imagine that you may have done some reading on death. An author named Caitlin Doherty has a book called Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, and in that she talks about avoiding the cost of funeral home by going directly to the crematory. I get asked all the time if that's a possibility, and unfortunately in our state it's not. You have to go through a funeral home or at least use a licensed funeral director for the cremation process. So once you schedule the cremation, the body is prepared. So again, in Connecticut, it's a requirement that we sanitize the remains prior to transfer to the crematory. So no embalming is required for cremation. Nothing invasive would be done. It would simply be removing any soiled linens and bathing the remains. Sometimes families like to identify in person or spend some time, hold a hand, give a kiss prior to the cremation process. Most funeral homes allow that. And from there, we would place the remains into a rigid combustible container. So on the screen, it looks more like a coffin shape. In reality, it's just a cardboard box that fits the remains. You can upgrade that container. Like I mentioned, if you want to spend some time with your loved one, maybe you want something a little fancier than a cardboard box. Of course, as you increase the quality and construction of the container, you're increasing the price. So alternatively, you could also get a rental casket if you were having full services, but we will talk a little more about those options on the next slides. So once the person has been identified, the body's been prepared, basically just sanitized, and then placed into the rigid combustible container required by the crematory, we deliver it to the crematory. It's placed into the retort, and from a temperature between 1500 and 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. It takes about 1.5 to 2 hours for the cremation process. This does depend heavily on the crematory and their equipment. So some older equipment may take longer, maybe closer to 3 hours, especially if the person weighs more. Larger individuals take a longer amount of time, as you can imagine. That's the primary cremation process. Following that, a magnet is used to remove bits of metal that may be left behind, and any long bones or remains that aren't as fine as we would like them before we put them into the urn go through a secondary cremation process, and they ground the remaining bones and bits into fine cremated remains. People call it ashes, but I discourage the use of that word, because if you imagine ashes when you get back cremated remains and look at them, you'll be surprised. It's actually larger pieces. I would compare it more to like a sand on a rocky beach. When complete, the remains are transferred into a temporary container. Most crematories will provide the cremated remains back in either a temporary plastic or wood container. And then, of course, the family can select an urn. Urns can be purchased from the funeral home, or they can be brought to the funeral home, purchased elsewhere. I know Amazon sells urns that can be personalized. I've had people bring in pieces that they found like at TJ Maxx. So really the sky's the limit with options for urns. These days, with scattering being such a popular option or placement into the water, they have biodegradable urns that could be disintegrated in water, or urns that you could bury with seeds to grow into a tree. So lots of different options for containers. And let's get into some of the different options for cremation services. So I said before that oftentimes people come to me and they say, I want to be cremated and that's it. And this is my mom. Okay, I told you she had some tragedy and she does not want a funeral in a funeral home. She knows what I do. She knows that I've got all the connections in the world, but she does not want that. She wants a direct cremation and scatter off the Florida coast. So I told her, Mom, that's good. I'll do that for you. But my brother and I need some more instruction. We're going to want to do something for you to acknowledge our hurt and our grief. So, tell me how I can honor your life. What sort of thing would you like? She said, well, after you scatter the cremated remains in the water, she didn't tell me what it is, but she left us a recipe. She wants us to go cook this meal in her honor and have this family meal. She picked out a song and she wrote a poem. So in her case, services would take place after the cremation without any sort of cremated remains, right? Because we would have already scattered them. So don't feel like if you've already placed the cremated remains in a cemetery or a niche mausoleum, whatever, if the remains are no longer present, you can absolutely still host a memorial. Of course, the urn can be present if you wanted to have services with an urn. What a lot of people don't realize is you could have services prior to cremation with a ceremonial casket, or if you don't like the idea of renting a casket, they make plenty of all wood constructed caskets. Not that much less expensive than a traditional casket, but A lot of churches, specifically Greek Orthodox or Catholic, they don't sometimes, despite the Pope coming in 2016 openly acknowledging cremation, some churches are a little more traditional, and they really encourage families to bring the full remains to church in a casket for the mass prior to the cremation. So of course that is an option. You can still have traditional services. That insert that's coming out of the casket would be unique to the individual. The shell would be reused a number of times before the entire casket would be cremated. So lots of options with services either before or after, and many more options for final placement of cremated remains. So these images on the screen are just several options that exist for final placement of cremated remains. In the top left, you see scattering at sea. Now that's what my mom wants. The picture shows the temporary plastic container from the crematory, and inside is a plastic bag. So that is very accurate of what it looks like. I did mention that they sell biodegradable urns. So what I got from my mom is it's shaped like a shell, and the cremated remains go in there. You're able to place the whole vessel, the whole urn, you throw the whole into the water, and then you watch it float for a little time, and then it sinks and biodegrades. So I've heard a lot of stories if people are on a boat or in a helicopter trying to scatter cremated remains. It's windy. I've seen a lot of comedy skits talk about how cremated remains scatterings goes way off of what they had planned. So those new options for the biodegradable containers are really great. In the middle, you've got placement at a cemetery or a mausoleum, or a columbarium is what it's known for, the cremated remains. That would be an above ground placement. These exist indoors and outdoors. The image here is very, very fancy. I'm not sure if we've even got an option like that in Connecticut, but maybe. So those options exist. Of course, you can bury cremated remains in ground. That's a very popular option. With cemetery property being so expensive these days, a lot of people find that if they call the local cemetery that handled their parents' arrangements, more often than not, you can have your cremated remains placed right on top of your relatives' graves if they were buried in a casket. To the right on the top, you see an urn on a shelf at someone's home. So that is a popular choice. I don't personally recommend it because at some point we're going to have to do something with the cremated remains. Maybe it's great if there's a husband and a wife, the husband dies first and the wife keeps the cremated remains until she dies, and then they're both buried or both scattered. I like that plan. I don't like the plan of keep me on the kitchen counter because I want to have Thanksgiving dinner with you every year forever and ever. Well, the children die, and then the grandchildren inherit the cremated remains, and then the great grandchildren, and eventually people have custody of this cremated remains of a person they've never met, and they bring them back to the funeral home, or we've found them, sometimes in the garbage. I've had grocery stores call me that they've had cremated remains abandoned in grocery carts. So not a good idea to just stay on the counter forever. For a time, maybe, yes, I can find comfort in that, but at some point you need to give your family permission to permanently place you somewhere. Bottom left is one of my favorite options. I was at a trade show for the funeral industry, and I met this woman who was an artist out of New York City, and the way that she would make her art is she would incorporate pieces of what she was designing into the art itself. So if she was doing a piece of a tree, she would take literal tree bark and glue it on, and that was her style. So when her dad died, she wanted to express herself through art, and she laid out all the cremated remains she got back, and she separated them based on their color, light color, dark color, gray color. And she pieces together bits of cremated remains for these portraits. So when you look at these portraits, you're really looking at your loved one. They're actual cremated remains. Now, that's about $9,000. And when she gave me that price, that was probably 3 or 4 years ago. So I'm sure it's even more than that now. And it was about a year from the time of the order until she could get it back to you. But a very cool option and very unique. Following that, we've got jewelry. So that's a very popular option for cremated remains. Of course, that wouldn't handle all of the cremated remains, just a very small portion of the cremated remains would be sent to the jewelry designer, and they would incorporate it right into the jewelry. Turning the cremated remains into diamonds has become a popular yet expensive option. And in the bottom right, you've got outer space. I mentioned it before. I'm not sure if you heard it, but you can absolutely send your cremated remains into outer space. Not sure of all the details where they end up, what the whole guarantee is there, but it's certainly an option. So we can look more into that together if you guys are interested, because as I'm telling you about it, I think I'd like to know more details about where they actually go. Okay, so what if you don't want cremation? Lots of people don't want cremation. It is a preference. I personally like green burial. So you'll see on the far right of this screen is an example of what a green burial would look like. So green burial is a less expensive alternative to traditional burial in that you don't need to purchase a casket or an outer burial container, also known as a vault. There's only 5 cemeteries currently in Connecticut that allow this option for green burial. But I would say it's about half the price of a traditional burial because you don't have any embalming, nothing invasive, no casket, no vault. The cemetery fees are a little bit less as well because most of these green burial grounds do not allow the placement of markers. So it would look more like an open meadow than a cemetery if you're looking at it. But the idea is to go back to nature. They actually, with this option, I've heard people opting to get buried in a mushroom burial suit. So if you really want to speed up decomposition, the mushroom burial suit's the way to go. In the middle picture, you see traditional casket at a cemetery. Now, this is what the rest of the cemeteries and burials that take place in Connecticut would look like. So this is the most common form of burial. And then on the left, you see what's called alkaline hydrolysis. This is called like green cremation. So instead of fire to break down the remains, they actually use 92 gallons of water mixed with 4 gallons of potash lye, and it dissolves the remains. The family doesn't get anything back on this one except for the bones. So the bones then would be just like the secondary cremation process that we talked about. They would be ground up and returned to the family. Everything else would, I guess, go into the sewer system. This one is not legal in Connecticut yet, but a very close alternative called, gosh, what's it called? It's like anyways, New York State just legalized it. Basically, it's a quickened breakdown of the remains, and they give you some wheelbarrows full of soil. Human composting. Sorry for not being able to come up with that word. So human composting started off on the West Coast, but New York last year, I think it was, or maybe earlier this year, has went ahead and legalized the human composting as a form of disposition. So we'll see if Connecticut is next, but so far, these are the options. The alkaline hydrolysis, I do believe there's one of the funeral homes I work with partners with a provider on the West Coast that they are able to offer this option, but it wouldn't be done locally. So those of you that are interested, you can always call Smart Funeral Planning and figure out which providers in Connecticut offer which services. We're going to talk a little bit about how simple it is to plan ahead. So Smart Funeral Planning, like I said, was created in 2021. Nothing ever has existed like this in Connecticut. It's more or less a shopping service for those looking to pre-plan and price shop. So first, we would have a conversation and just explore what your wishes and options are, talk a little bit kind of like we are right now, and let you know what options exist that we could legally fulfill and talk about your budget. And more or less partner you with the plan so that your family doesn't have to make those decisions at the time of grieving. We estimate there's over 100 questions that people are asked immediately following a death. And the two questions we never want to be left unanswered are, did we do the right thing? And is this what my loved one wanted? So we do offer free planning guides as well. Anybody who's interested could call or request one through our website. We have PDF fillable versions, all completely free 15-minute phone consults. So absolutely no excuse not to get a plan in place. Touch on some other considerations. So the importance of a prepaid funeral contract versus a traditional life insurance policy is that they're Title 19 and Medicaid compliant. So for those of you doing your estate planning, maybe nearing retirement, starting to think about how you're going to carry on your life now that you're not bringing an income in, oftentimes now we outlive our resources. You know, we live 30 years after we retire. So what does that look like? In Connecticut, we have a great program called Medicaid Title 19, and the state covers the majority of your care. In order to qualify for that, there are income limits. So if you prepay a funeral, it's considered an exempt asset, or if you prepay a cremation, it's exempt. The state can never take it away from you when qualifying for those benefits. If you've got a traditional life insurance policy, whatever the cash value of that policy is would be counted against you when qualifying. So if your sole purpose of life insurance is covering the cost of final arrangements, it's a no-brainer to go ahead and call your local funeral home or Smart Funeral Planning and let us get a plan in place that can never be taken away from you like a traditional life insurance could. Excuse me. Next of kin determination is something that's super important, especially for cremation. So people oftentimes assume like, oh yeah, of course, like my eldest son will handle this because he knows my wishes and he's the most responsible. That's great, but if you haven't specifically designated that individual to carry out your wishes, it's going to go by the letter of the law. And the law says the first person who would get custody of your deceased remains would be your surviving spouse, if applicable. So number one, the person who gets custody of deceased would be a surviving spouse. If you've lived with a person 50 years and you consider them your spouse, but they're not legally your spouse, guess what? They have no rights to your body and the disposition of it. So you can name them with a form called the appointment of agent for the right to disposition. And again, Smart Funeral Planning has those forms. You could also maybe get it from an attorney. But if you don't have a spouse, it would go to all children 18 and older have an equal say. So all of them would need to sign off on the cremation, or at least a majority, with the funeral home notating that we tried to reach all of them. In Connecticut, you do have the option to self-authorize your cremation. So you can make note that cremation is your wish. And in that case, then only one child would need to sign off. If you don't have any children or a spouse, it would go to any surviving parents, and then siblings, and then extended relatives. So I can't stress enough the importance of determining in advance who would be responsible for handling your final arrangements, and make sure that you've had conversations with them to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Next, we'll talk about Social Security benefits. Turns out Social Security benefits have not increased since the 1930s when they were invented. So sorry, it's this dryer in my home. So the Social Security benefit is only received by a surviving spouse. So only a surviving spouse gets the benefit, and it's only $255. Maybe in 1930, $255 covered a large or some portion of the cremation or funeral. But in today's world, $255 doesn't get you that far. And again, if you're a child or a sibling of the deceased, then you would not qualify for that Social Security benefit. So today, all that's available is $255. Veterans benefits also lacking We do have a wonderful state veterans cemetery in Middletown, Connecticut, and they allow the veteran with an honorable discharge to be interred there along with the veteran's spouse or dependent children. They have a choice between in-ground burial or above-ground placement. Above-ground placement option only available for cremation. And they would cover the cost for the cemetery property, the grave opening, and any sort of memorialization, meaning a headstone or inscription. What's not covered is all the costs from the funeral home, which would be any sort of preparation, embalming, transferring, casket, vault, urn, those things the veteran would, or the veteran's family would be on their own. So just some important things to consider here when we're talking about final arrangements. I am ready to hear your thoughts and questions. So let me stop sharing my screen and we can go